Welcome, everyone, to Indications and Warnings with Chuck Farrer, co-produced by Alan Brewer. Chuck and I are recording this show on day 1029 of Russia's full-scale genocidal invasion of Ukraine. It is December 18, 2024. Chuck, I'm thinking of titling this show, Ukraine Now, Hardships and Hopes. Ukraine seems to be caught between hardships and hopes right now.
Well, we are still reaping the harvest planted by Mike Johnson just about a year ago today. This is the nadir of Ukraine's military fortunes. This is what happens when you undersupply, underdeliver, and overpromise. So, there are Russian advances. There have been all summer. Interestingly, they don't add up to much more than 1% of Ukraine's landmass, and that's the way to take this. That's the top line to take away from it. There are places on the battlefield where the advances have been, frankly, significant. So we have seen the Russians successful in pushing from Avdiivka, which it took them more than 10 years to capture. And they have been able to move the zero line up to Pokrovsk, but interestingly, they're nowhere closer to capturing that city than they were, frankly, when they were back in Avdiivka. And you and I were talking about what that has cost the Russians, and I underestimated it, but your information is better, and I think you ought to tell the people how much it's cost Russia to get where they are now.
There are reports that Russia has lost more men and equipment in advancing toward Pokrovsk than it lost in taking Bakhmut. So approaching 100,000, potentially surpassing 100,000 to advance those 20-odd miles between Avdiivka and Pokrovsk. It is absolutely awful, unsustainable loss for Russia to sacrifice. And what will they have for it at the end, Chuck?
Well, to put this in terms of Soviet and Russian military history, we're talking World War II casualty numbers. When we're talking 120, 130,000 dead in one area of operations, Russia hasn't seen those sorts of losses. In fact, no military on earth has seen those kinds of losses in the 21st century, but since World War II. And, so it's two guys with beards up here telling you the Russians lost 100,000 people in just one location. What correlates that? Well, they've lost 765,000 dead, wounded, missing in the last 1,000-odd days. Unsustainable, right? They are moving the territorial needle, but they are hollowing out their force, Alan. You cannot sustain this level of casualties and keep your army fit, in fine fiddle, and ready to fight some more. And it's going to be a long winter for the Russians.
Yeah, daily casualties have exceeded 2,000 once or twice. Daily casualties for Russia right now, that's killed, wounded, missing in action, relatively low. It's just between 1,000 and 1,500 a day. And a lot of those casualties are occurring in and around Pokrovsk. We're going to take a look at the Pokrovsk map a little bit later in this show. But in developing these themes of hardships and hopes, among the hopes I would put the assassination of the Russian general in Moscow. I think that must raise the hopes of all Ukrainians.
Yeah, and we're going to take a bit of a deep dive into that later. But what a bold operation like that does is it has affected the manner in which everybody and Colonel on up in Moscow has now changed their life patterns, right? They are now varying their paths to work. They are coming and going at different times. They are checking under their cars. When they come home, they're looking for a flower pot that wasn't there when they left. All of this grinds down and on the adversary, and it reminds Putin and everyone else that you're not safe anywhere. You're not safe on the Death Star, right? Wandering the streets of Moscow, you're not safe there. And we're going to see more high profile targets like this. And we'll talk a little bit about the operational history that Ukraine has on the ground in denied areas. In all of the vastness of Russia, they have shown again and again and again that they can plan it, they can pull it off, and more importantly, they can get away with it.
Yeah, I think that the other hopeful thing about this assassination is it brings a war criminal to justice. This was the general responsible for Russia's use of chemicals on the battlefield in Ukraine. Now, there are, those chemicals have been used thousands of times already in the course of this war. There are more than 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers who have been chemically injured as a result of Russia's use of chemical agents on the battlefield.
Right. The Russians are principally using two anti-riot agents, CS, which is what you'll get if you're at a Berkeley protest. That's probably what's going to get thrown at you. There's one that's a click up that's called CN. It is also principally an irritant. But the Russians are also using asphyxiant agents, and those are tear gas. This is something that, it makes you cry, and it's a skin irritant. When you use it in high capacities, it becomes more serious. An asphyxiant is a gas that interferes not only with your respiration, but there have been indications that they have used what are called blood agents. And these are cyanide-based industrial gases, and they interfere with the manner in which your red blood cells carry oxygen in your body. So all of this has been clicking upward. First, it was an infantryman throwing a tear gas grenade. So that's almost sustainable. But then it was drones dropping large numbers of grenades. Then it was the occasional use of a mortar or an artillery shell filled with chemical agents. These are all bright red shining lines, but they're all clicking upward.
Well, we will take a look at that operation. In terms of hardships, of course, we will speak not only of hardships on the zero line, but hardships in Ukraine's cities. The massive Russian air assault continues. Power plants able to supply electricity to 1 million homes a night have been destroyed. Today, Zelensky is in Brussels meeting with Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO. Rutte assured Zelensky that his request for 19 additional air defense systems was on the agenda and will be considered. Those 19 air defense systems, whether Patriots or NASAMS or IRSTs, could have preserved Ukraine's electrical grid and saved the lives of Ukrainian citizens had they been delivered 1,000 days ago.
It's infuriating to hear about NATO deigning to consider whether Ukraine needs more air defense. it needs a no-fly zone. And it needs the kind of air defense domain over the nation of Ukraine that equals if it flies, it dies. And there is no one who has looked at this war who cannot say that the Russians are taking it out on Ukrainian cities. They're not just targeting power plants, which I would have to admit is a legitimate military target. But for every power plant that's hit, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 times as many precision munitions are simply directed against population centers. Kharkiv, Dnipro, Zaporizhzhia, all of these cities have just been hit again and again and again. Ruski Mir. I published a photograph this week. It showed a little tiny Ukrainian first responder standing in an Olympic swimming pool sized crater. That's Russia's primary export item is craters.
Yeah. And there are craters now, of course, all over Ukraine. In Kherson, Russian drone operators are practicing in what they call a human safari by attacking civilians and by attacking emergency vehicles, ambulances, fire trucks. Their new tactic is actually to drop tacks on the roadways of Kherson. You drive over them, your tire goes flat, you get out to change the tire, and a drone is going to come kill you.
Yeah. It's a war crime, right? It's a war crime to attack civilians getting out of a civilian vehicle. It's a war crime to target first responders. I mean, they orchestrate these attacks. They'll hit something and they'll wait 20, 30 minutes till the firemen, till the ambulance, to whomever shows up, and then they'll hit all of the first responders. And nowhere has this barbarity been raised to its pinnacle as Kherson. Just as you said, a human safari.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's take a look at the Ukrainian Special Operations Safari that made its way to Moscow, and let's look at how Ukraine accomplished this assassination of this very high level Russian general. There are a lot of interesting elements to it, Chuck.
Yeah, so the gentleman in question here, and I don't think he is a gentleman, it's General Igor Kirillov. He is the head of Russia's NBC, sometimes you could hear it as CBR, but nuclear, chemical, and biological countermeasures units. He, however, has slid into the role. He is responsible for prosecuting chemical attacks against Ukrainian soldiers and civilians as well. Here's what his last day was. He got up in the morning, he had coffee, maybe he read the newspaper, he checked some email, it's still dark outside. He hears, or maybe his aide-de-camp beeps out in the street. The general comes downstairs. He does not look left. He does not look right. He does not notice the scooter leaned up against the front of his building. The aide came out of the car and was preparing to open the door, and this scooter detonated. I can tell by the effect of the explosion against the building, you can see it pushed all the bricks in. This scooter, the charge on this scooter was oriented to either the right or the left. I can't tell because the scooter, but this was a focused charge. It had a kill envelope to address a certain conical blast area. And it only killed the two people it was intended to kill, the general and his aide. That's the easy part, right? That's all the general knows. That's all the public knows. This is an operation that occurred, and you and I were joking. This is like killing Darth Vader's little buddy on the Death Star, right? This is Ukraine operating in Moscow saying, we can get anyone. We can get anyone, and we'll go in a little bit on how they did it, but this says, look, we planned it, we carried it out, and you know what? We got away with it too, because they've arrested someone from Uzbekistan, 29-year-old man from Uzbekistan. He's been detained and has confessed to the killing. But if you give the Russians a civilian and a pair of pliers, they can get anyone to confess to anything. And this guy had nothing to do with it.
And that, first of all, no one believes that that this person could carry off an attack like this. You know, the first thing that struck me, Chuck, was the use of the scooter, an ordinary, everyday object that would not raise suspicion, leaned up against any building, any lamp post, or just dropped on the sidewalk. That's brilliance number one to me.
Yeah, and it harkened back. You and I were talking before the show. During the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong had the bicycle bomb. They just took a regular bicycle and they filled all the tubes up with plastic explosives. So to the naked eye, it looked like a regular bicycle. So in this case, there are a lot of scooters everywhere in every city. They're a bit of a bane in some cities. And the interesting thing is, in this case, I am virtually certain that one of the conspirators probably rode this scooter to the target location. And then you chain it up or whatever. Don't want to make sure anyone gets away with it. And they set it off. To me, the fun part is how they did it and how absolutely complex it is and how many times they've done it before. This isn't their first rodeo, and they're almost showing to connoisseurs, maybe like me, this was an elegant plan. This was textbook. You would study this at the farm because it's that perfect.
Well, it's perfect also because, as you say, they got away with it. Whoever did it simply melted away into the night, into the Moscow night.
Yeah. So you've got a plan like this. I'm just beanbagging here, but to pull this off, I'd like to have 15 people. So just that is pretty good. I have 15 people who have cover for action, cover for status, and cover for movement. So I've got 15 people with good paperwork. They've got patterns of movement. You stop them on the street. He says, I live over on Munkensplatz over there, 226. Okay, I work over here. Okay. Just that is, people can see that's pretty cool. Now I have to break those people into about 5 or 6 different cellular organizations that never touch. So I've got an intelligence cell that conducts the reconnaissance. I've got a planning cell that will get all the intelligence and work up a plan. None of these guys know each other. I've got a ordnance cell who will put together the weapon. So they're responsible for smuggling in the explosive, getting a hold of a scooter, making sure it looks like every other scooter. Then I've got a dedicated communication cell. They simply pick up messages and deliver them from point A to point B. They don't know what the messages say. They don't know who they're going to. These are a series of dead drops, some of them physical, meaning, I put a plan on a piece of paper and I put it in a Coke can and somebody moves the Coke can, or more and more these days, things are done digitally. So this would have taken, I don't know, to do this right, I need probably 21 days. But often, if you've got the assets in place, and sometimes you have to work on an accelerated timeline. So all of those little networks I just said, all cells of about 3 people or so, someone like a conductor has to conduct them all. And that's the operational cell. Okay, that's not the planning cell. That isn't even the command cell. You can see where this is going. So they had to identify this guy, his patterns of movement, where he worked, what time he went to work, They watched him or leaned on him, as we say, possibly for months. They knew if he had a girlfriend. They knew what his wife was doing. They knew his patterns of movement. And it's just incredible. To carry this out around Melitopol in the occupied territories, that would be admirable. To carry this out 600 miles from the zero line in the beating black heart of the empire, it's amazing, Alan. It's amazing.
And guys like this general obviously feel very secure, very safe at home. That leads them not to change their daily patterns as they should, because they feel so safe.
Yeah, he was in the rear with the gear and the beer. I mean, he took the extremely limited counter surveillance measures. He felt that he was absolutely as safe as he could be. He probably didn't vary his work patterns at all. That guy probably showed up at 7 o'clock every morning by his front door, and you could set the clock by it. So the good thing about a strike like this, and we mentioned this a little earlier, it changes the working patterns of every single person in Moscow from about major on up. And it's going to make them look over their shoulders. It's going to make them vary their route they take home. It's going to make them have to leave earlier or later, and change everything and constantly be on guard, right? So someone who is highly threatened, and if you're working in their protective detail, it isn't just being right there next to them. You want to vary their patterns of motion. You want to run a zonal surveillance operation. You do, when you're moving your principal, you're doing a surveillance detection route. All the even stupid things you see on spy movies. One of them is always great. You make 3 left turns and there's somebody still behind you, you're getting followed. Right? Nobody makes 3 left turns. But just that is what is so great. And it isn't just like these big wigs. Ukraine has shown that if you're a lieutenant commander in charge of a submarine that was shooting cruise missiles at elementary schools, we're going to get you. We're going to get you while you're jogging. It's going to go down. The people that I am delighted to say are sweating the load right now, another SEAL colloquialism, the bright-faced young officers who work in the targeting cells, the people that come up with the 8-digit grid coordinates on pediatric hospitals, elementary schools, churches, theaters, not just power plants, but Ukraine has shown it's going to go after these guys as well. And all of that distraction, all of this increased security. I mean, imagine this if this happened in Washington, D.C. I mean, imagine if they took out the head of the Army's chemical corps. Bang, blew him up with a. Think of what that would do to the security apparatus and the atmosphere in Moscow. And that's exactly what it's done to Putin.
Yeah.
And this is a pie in his face, too. He can't protect his thugs. He can't do it.
Now, it so happens that General Kellogg, who is President-elect Trump's appointed peace envoy to Ukraine, said such an assassination is a mistake, that there's no wisdom to it. But the way I see it is Ukraine brought a war criminal to justice, and this general is a legitimate target, just like the Japanese admiral who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. Totally
Yamamoto.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is. But General Kellogg is talking about one of his peers getting taken out. No general wants to say, "Hey, it's okay that you knocked off this general." However, look behind the scenes. Look, this guy's a totally legit target. And look at it this way. So there are limited, highly capable, but limited intelligence and covert operations resources in Moscow. right? So you and I have talked to Doug London on many occasions, and it's great when Doug comes aboard and we talk about one of these operations. But you always want to, you look at the target, you look at your assets, you look at risk to reward. Uh, the decision was made at the highest levels that this was a worthwhile target. There was going to be bang to the buck on this target, and there was. And do I think this guy's a legitimate target? Absolutely. He just happens to be a war criminal.
Like just about everybody else in the Russian military, from the lowest private to the highest general or marshal in service to Putin's full-scale genocidal invasion. It is genocide that Russia is attempting to commit here in Ukraine.
And here's another good thing. So let's look at this. This scooter was probably in place, I don't know, I'd like 2 hours before that's enough time to get in, cool down. But the great thing is, so they moved by the time they moved the scooter to the target, they had reeled in everybody else. The planning cell was gone. The reconnaissance cell had vaporized. The communication cell had vaporized. Everybody was rolled up with airtight alibis somewhere else, and maybe even out of the country by the time the last operator drove that cycle up. And I assure you, there were plans and contingency plans and alternate routes examined and all sorts of other things, including what happens if the bomb doesn't go off, right? It's cold. It's an electronic device. Is it going to work when we want it to work? All of those things, the little nuts and bolts, which I don't know. It was a great part of my life for a long time. So it's nice to see it when it all comes together.
And this bomb was set off remotely, right, Chuck? So there had to be someone with eyes on the target.
Yeah, absolutely. But you can do that in so many ways, right? So I've got a little Garmin camera in my car that points forward, like a million other people. You don't even have to have anybody in the car, right? You can remotely activate the camera. It's looking. We always say in the SEALs, one is none. So on that device, I want 2 or 3 independent and redundant firing circuits, right? I don't want to push the one button that doesn't work. If the one doesn't work, I'm going to try 2, 3, 4, and 5. And there doesn't have to be eyes on the target anymore. You could even hack somebody's camera. You've reconnoitered this target area, and you see someone parks here every single night across the street, and she's got a Garmin 2295 driver's cam, which, by the way, are ubiquitous in Russia because the traffic is insane, and almost everyone in Russia has a dash cam. So all you got to do is hack that. You could just see how elegant this is. No one even has to be there. You could put a cell phone in a bag of garbage, within Bluetooth range, and that broadcast to something else. And every bit of this operation was that elegant. Every bit of it. So, and the only thing the Russians have right now probably is there was a phone call made exactly at the moment that the bomb went off. And that was the initiation signal. But that's going to come back to a burner phone that was bought in Uzbekistan 7 weeks ago. That's only made one call, and that was it. It's going to be a total dead end.
Well, the elegance of it is that it occurred in the heart of Moscow. And
and they're going to do it again.
Yeah, we haven't seen such efforts succeed on the Russian part. Ukraine actually just rolled up 12 agents in Ukraine who were there looking for F-16 bases. And where are the F-16s? The Russians apparently can't figure that out. These 12 agents were all arrested before they had found anything. But it can't be that hard to find an F-16, can it, Chuck?
You would think they make a distinctive sound, but notice the number who were rolled up, 12, right? So that sounds to me like four three-man elements. But when I hear a magic number like 12, it tells me, look, they penetrated that. One person came under suspicion and they noticed that he communicated with these other people. And their own operational security was so poor and their tradecraft was bad that you could roll up the whole network, which is actually, the Soviets and later the Russians were really, really good at this kind of stuff. So, and I don't know who these people were. Were they Ukrainians? Were they actual Russian intelligence officers? What was their motivation? Whenever you're looking at a foreign, a hostile asset or operator or officer, they're all slightly different. Your own defectors, we're always looking at mice, right? How is it that you find yourself looking for F-16s for the Russians, right? It's money. You're getting paid to do it. It's ideology. You're a hardened Marxist. It's compromise. You got caught in the trailways station bathroom, and it's ego. Or sometimes it's all, money, ideology, compromise, or ego. And wrapping up those cells too, it tells the Russians, we've got to tighten up our tradecraft, right? They just rolled up an entire operational team. And what's so good about that is this is what's constantly going on with the SBU. Constantly. This is one of the most important battles that's going on. You can imagine finding that F-16 base was an extremely high importance operation.
Yeah. And again, this is the success of Ukraine, both on offense and on defense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
So,
they're the most experienced warfighters in the 21st century battle space. Unfortunately, the Russians are probably the second most experienced, with the giant but caveat that they don't learn. They have not adapted. They are doing everything they can to win this war with a plan right out of 1983.
yeah.
And it isn't working. That's why we're looking at 765,000 casualties. Whoa.
It will be
Whoa.
1 million by the time we reach spring. So
Absolutely.
I was a little disappointed to hear General Kellogg decry this assassination, or what I will call bringing this general to justice, because he was a war criminal. I was disappointed to hear him decry this operation. I've been equally troubled by hearing some of President-elect Trump's criticisms of Ukraine, particularly saying he would not have approved so-called deep strikes into Russia using ATACMS, scalps, storm shadows, what have you. What troubles me about that is two things. First of all, he would say no. But secondly, he misapprehends what a deep strike is. None of these weapons, ATACMS especially, are deep strike weapons.
Yeah, he lobs this out into the infosphere. I wouldn't approve any ATACMS strikes on Moscow. Well, of course you wouldn't. It can't get to Moscow. I wouldn't approve deep strikes against Russian airfields. You're right, because those weapons are manufactured in Ukrainian garages, springing from the genius mind of Ukrainian technologists. And that's, I would hope the president knows better, and or the people around him should have the messaging. But I see this as a bit of a rope-a-dope to the Russians. Well, I wouldn't have approved this strike, right? But in the meantime, we all should be happy and delighted that the Ukrainians are handling those deep strikes on their own. Thank you very much. I think it's probably, in the case of General Kellogg, look, God bless him. But no four-star general really wants to see other four-star generals targeted in their own backyard. It is definitely not off the table that there are Russian intelligence officers right now attempting to lay the groundwork for operations like that in Washington, D.C. And I am not kidding. So we'll see that. You know, it's funny, Alan, I don't know how many people are in Washington, D.C. or listening to this are going to visit Washington, D.C. There is so much espionage going on in Washington at any one time. It's crazy. You go there on a training exercise or you're training people in Washington and you're sitting there and you're doing a surveillance detection route. And there's almost never been a single exercise that I've been on that we haven't noticed somebody else doing the same thing, right? We haven't noticed someone else doing a surveillance detection route. People, I don't know. I don't know who they are. You know, are they an agent being run by us? Is it a bad guy? You know, but you go into Washington, I want you to have fresh eyes. Look at a telephone pole and why are there 5 thumbtacks on that? Why is there a chalk mark on this wall? Why is there a crayon? Who drew a crayon circle on that windshield? You start seeing all this crazy stuff. And believe me, you're just pulling the curtain aside a little bit because it is an operationally dense environment.
No question about it. It would be a fun kind of day tour to take, actually, and then take a test at the end of the day. I had a friend in Washington when I worked there who pointed out a few things like that to me. And that was in the good old days when there were dead drops. And of course, people use dead drops today because it's the old school way. Less noticed today than it was 40 years ago when it was actually searched for and looked for.
Yeah, there was a time where our training pipeline sort of changed and there was less and less human. You know, the old dead drop, load signal, comm site, surveillance detection route, brush pass, everything that everyone who loves spy movies, all that stuff kind of simmered down because there were digital means, everyone said, but they were so easily compromised. There was a time where they had to drag out old time war horses like me. And, you know, you set these things up using a manual typewriter and the old stuff, man, how do you make a microdot? Well, interestingly enough, you can go online and see all of these things that only a handful of people used to know. I mean, you can get right on there and make yourself a microdot. It's kind of fun if you're a kid listening to this. You know, hey, go ahead and make a microdot. It's pretty cool.
So while I put the assassination in the hopeful category, I put General Kellogg's and President-elect Trump's comments in actually the less hopeful category. We're not suffering under misapprehension as hardship yet in Ukraine, but unless the Trump Ukrainian team sharpens its tune, we're going to be in for the same with this administration.
Well, you know, and they will have to sharpen their tune. And, you know, I don't hold this out as hope, and everyone knows, I mean, you know, on this show, we are as politically agnostic as we can possibly be. President Trump this isn't a real estate deal, right? He has leverage over Ukraine, and that's basically we won't give you anything and the Russians can eat your lunch. Okay, negative reinforcement, as we used to say in psychology, it doesn't make any sense. What is the commander in chief's leverage over Putin? Well, it has to be we're going to give Ukraine the tools to fit all of your army in an ashtray. Okay, that's what's going to have to bring you to the table. So eventually he's going to have to use that. And here's one of the things that makes me hopeful is that you can't trust Putin. And whatever he agrees to or says to President Trump or in this peace deal or whatever, he won't negotiate in good faith.
Right.
He thinks he's smarter than everybody. He's not going to be bound by any treaty. And the Soviet Union before it was never bound by any treaty at all. Even the major ones, the Biological Warfare Convention in 1972, they
Right.
went right ahead making biological weapons until, well, they still make biological weapons to this day. And General Kirilov, as he discovered in Moscow, they know who he is too.
Yeah. I think Zelensky should revisit his remark that it came at the opening of the war. I don't need a ride. I need ammunition. Today, he should be saying, I don't need advice. I need those 19 air defense systems. And he doesn't need anyone's advice, frankly. He still needs ammunition.
Right. And we see only the tip of the iceberg, right? We can all see what's being done to places like Kharkiv Dnipro and Zaporizhzhia. We can see the cruise missiles and the other precision strike missiles that are targeting those civilians. Ukraine has insufficient air defense systems, and unfortunately, because of the way Russia is fighting, they have to prioritize or at least designate a great portion of those air defense systems, including the highly mobile systems. IRIS-T to NASM itself is a bit mobile. But something certainly like the Gepard, these are mobile point defense systems, and they all wind up parked in city parks in Ukrainian cities to protect civilians. What we don't see is Ukrainian ground lines of communication and their battlefield logistics and even their frontline positions don't have the air defense that a NATO army requires. We're going to get a new commander-in-chief, but I'd like everyone listening to know that the advice from the Pentagon isn't going to change a bit, right? Everyone in that building knows what Ukraine needs. Everybody. And I mean from the corporal work and the copy machine, everybody knows what they need, right? That advice doesn't change from the Pentagon. I mean, that loop goes something like this. I'm a four-star general. I'm in charge of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I say to the commander-in-chief, what's the end state? What do you want to happen on the ground in Ukraine? I'll make it happen. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that message was getting to the Pentagon in the last 3 or 4 years. I just don't think it is.
I don't think it got there. It clearly didn't get there. The response maybe from Biden himself was, I want to help Ukraine defend itself. Of course, that's not an end state on the ground.
Yeah.
It's much, much simpler to say, I want Ukraine to have the force and power to drive out every single Russian soldier who's currently occupying the country. Now, that's
precisely.
Pretty simple way to state the end state.
Absolutely. The other thing is that, and we talked about this before, and again, I'm not on an R or a D here. I will criticize the commander in chief, right? I'm in my lane. I understand military matters. I'm in my lane. There were so many tools available to the outgoing administration. There were presidential decision directives. There were executive orders. Look, these can be huge in scope. All of JSOC operates off one presidential decision directive. Nobody's ever seen it because it's so highly classified, but there is a sixth side to the Pentagon, and that is JSOC. It has a budget that is equivalent to the Marine Corps and the Coast Guard thrown in and a couple other services. That's all on a presidential decision directive. There's so much that could have been done out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue a long time ago. And you and I, we talked about it when Mike Johnson betrayed Ukraine last year. Even if he pulled the trigger and let the Ukrainians have the stuff, it's going to cross the Atlantic at 12 knots, right? You can't make a battalion of armor appear on the battlefield in Ukraine. You just can't. It takes time. And look, I still have a lot to be embarrassed about when it comes to the United States of America. And it is embarrassment.
Yeah.
You know, we are not helping the Ukrainians out, and we owe them, right? We said, we are your security guarantors. What are we doing?
We're not guaranteeing the security, unfortunately, today. And I actually want to circle through Syria on our way to the maps in Ukraine, Chuck. Russia, of course, was Syria's security guarantor. Now, with the fall of Assad, Russia has lost an important outpost here in Syria. Any news about whether or not Russia will find a way to retain its air base and its naval base in Syria? They have been evacuating, but now apparently those evacuations have moved along at a kind of stop and start.
Yeah, and I can tell you, this is what it's all about right here. So you have, we talked about this before. We have got the last 20 minutes of the film Lawrence of Arabia right now. When T.E. Lawrence arrived in Damascus and everything was chaos, the principal vector of chaos was everybody trying to get a slice, right? Everybody, remember all the people waving the papers, they all had motions, everyone has desires now. HTS, which is doing its absolute best to put people, give them haircuts and put them in clean fatigues and have them speak nice to the press. I just want to remind everyone that, look, this was Al-Qaeda, this was ISIS, this was Al-Nusra, this is now HTS. And all they did was put more and more potted plants in the front office, right? These guys were head choppers. They would put you in an orange jumpsuit, splash you with gasoline, and light you on fire. That's who we're dealing with. Everyone has desires. HTS wants to deliver an Islamic State to Syria. It needs money to do that. It needs money to stay on top. It needs money to change things on the ground in Syria. Look, the Arab world works very differently than any other place on earth, right? There are cultural issues. There is, it is not a negative thing to expect to get paid for the things you bring to the table. And I just want everyone to realize, look, this is not Patrick Henry and the Green Mountain Boys figuring out how to get the Continental Congress together. This is deadly serious, and where Syria is going to go, I have an idea where it might go. But in the meantime, I think the Russians they are paying to get their people out. They're going to have to pay to do that. And if they want naval bases in the Mediterranean, which is a strategic objective for Moscow, they're going to have to pay for that as well. The good thing is they're going to have to pay, right? This isn't a thing that Putin can, they have him by the short hairs, and they're going to make him pay, or they're going to make his people suffer. And there are still half a dozen occupied positions, occupied by Russian soldiers, that are cut off and totally surrounded. So this is a minute by minute thing that Putin has going on. And again, good news, bad news from Ukraine. All of this started last October 7th, when Hamas came out of the box. Russia and Iran were on top of the world. Everything was going their way. The dynamics of the Middle East were shaken up. Now that entire operation has the bed, right? That whole thing has collapsed quicker than they possibly could have imagined. It's an insoluble problem, Alan, and I'm delighted to see it unfold.
Absolutely delighted that it is Putin's problem and that the only solution to it is money that Russia is actually quickly running out of.
They are.
So
This is going to cost hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of greenback dollars, right?
and
And you still
that's if the new Syria uh, negotiates with the country that supported Assad's, killing of millions of Syrians. The two Assads together, the Ba'athist regime, are responsible for the death and disappearance of millions of Syrians.
right. And this isn't just anybody that HTS is talking to. This is the force that bombed almost every single hospital in Syria, that has been dropping fire on people. It has delivered steel into the belly of untold hundreds of thousands of Syrian civilians. So is there a deal to be made at all? I don't know. I think it'll go something like this. Yeah, we'll take $500 million a month for the next 3 months, and then we're going to turn on you anyway.
That would be a good deal.
Listen, it's not my first rodeo.
Uh, the deal that Putin struck with North Korea, we are getting a first look at, and this will bring us to the maps in Ukraine. And we do have a number of maps to go through tonight, Chuck, but we might as well start in Kursk, where North Korean troops have been seen on video in their first combat maneuver. I don't recall seeing anything like this since approximately the First World War.
Yeah, and this is billed as the North Korean combat debut. I'm one of those guys that thinks it goes back a little farther. However, that's absolutely moot here. Just kind of unpack this a little bit by talking about the efficacy of those North Korean troops on the battlefield. We have seen dozens and dozens and dozens of videos showing globulates, and that's not a war college term. That is whatever a globulate is, clutches of little people gathering together on the battlefield because they have no training whatsoever. They're thrown into a place that is very loud. There are flashes of light and there's steel flying around through the air, and they just group together because that's safer. They're trying to advance on targets with no artillery support, no support of indirect weapons, which is mortars, rocket launchers, heavy machine guns, nothing. So we're not looking at the great meeting of the two tactical geniuses here, a North Korean colonel and a Russian general who just say, run over there as fast as you can. It's atrocious. Even for North Koreans, I have to feel sorry for them. And you look at these pictures of these North Korean kids looking up at their hovering doom with no freaking clue. None.
A total look of surprise in their eyes, and apparently no notion of what is about to happen to them.
Well, and that's it. We because we've talked about this a lot regarding Russian forces in Ukraine. You get knocked on the head in the metro in Moscow. 2 weeks, 10 days, 7 days later, you're handed a rusty rifle in Donetsk, and you're in a car and you're driving to the front. You get thrown out and you're in battle. No training, no land navigation, no first aid. Guys go in with 2 magazines, right? You pull the trigger on an AK, and the first switch of the safety is actually rock and roll. It's not semi. And then you pull the trigger, it rocks back in your hand. You can't take your finger off the trigger. 2.5 seconds later, you've spent half your ammunition.
Right.
You've got 5 seconds of ammunition. That's why they die in their tens and hundreds of thousands.
And that is what is happening in Kursk, although Russia has deployed 50,000 troops at least, 10 to 15,000 North Korean troops either added to that number or part of that number. And while Ukraine has given up some of the territory it seized in Kursk, the incursion looks pretty steady.
It is. Ukraine has lost. They started out at their peak with about 1,000 square kilometers. It was actually a little bit more because it was, who controlled what. The situation was extremely dynamic. They're down now to about 400 square kilometers, but we talk a lot about constricting your defensive lines, right? Reducing your defensive lines. What Ukraine is hanging on to now is the area served by, and I should get my map up, central ground lines of communication and supply. The Ukrainians have got great main circuit cables, right? They've got a great logistical network. And we've talked about this a lot as well. Now the Ukrainians are on the defense and they have interior lines of communication and supply. So think of Ukraine, they're inside the barn, holding on to the barn, and the Russians are outside. So for the Russians to go anywhere, they have got to go all the way around the clock, right? If they want to attack at 9 o'clock and then at 6 o'clock, they've got to go hundreds of kilometers to do that. So again, and as Ukraine made this incursion, we talked about this at the very beginning. They were digging in as they went because they knew they wanted to hold on to this terrain. It's a bargaining chip. It was always to be defended, and they did it from the outset. It shows now in the Russian casualty numbers and where we see the Russians attacking, actually.
Well, there are no direct lines for the Russians to take as they go around the barn. All the direct routes belong to Ukraine inside this blob of Ukrainian control in Kursk Oblast. It's as you pointed out before, it's a perfect diagram of how you would want roads to allow you to move around the battlefield very quickly and to keep your troops supplied.
Absolutely. And this was in the planning cell. I mean, we talked about the logistical constraints that the United States has placed on Ukraine. They scraped together a force sufficient for an offensive. Then they had to choose, where do we do it? Right? Do we cross the river at Kherson? I don't think so. Do we try to blast the Russians back to Bakhmut? What would that do? Then they looked across the border, and then they looked at dozens of places, right? They picked a soft target, and the fact that what they've got now is a medium-sized city, Sudza, with all of the roads radiating out from it, just as you said, Alan. They picked this and said, if we get there and expand out from here and dig into this nucleus, we can hold this for a long time. And no accidents in war. Well, there are accidents in war, but good things do not develop accidentally. Well, almost never, but you can't count on an accident if you want to win.
And this is the beauty of map reading. As you say, they looked at dozens and dozens of places. Once they decided, why not take the war to Russia? They looked at dozens and dozens of places, and someone with sharp eyes looked at Sushta and said, well, just look at this. It's perfectly oriented for continuous supply, for rapid movement once we get into Kursk. And there are features of the terrain, especially watercourses, that allow us to defend pretty easily as well. Whoever,
Alan, you
whoever found this,
you've been
absolutely brilliant.
Alan has been studying at the graduate level for the last 1,000 days, and you got a good eye for terrain. Uh, Alan, you got an A in this. Exactly. There are water courses and bodies of water that are perfect for defense. In fact, I'm looking at the 3K80204. I'm looking at a stretch of that highway, and there are lakes to the east of it and lakes to the west of it. That's going to make that they own that. They own that highway. And those lakes and bodies of water, they channelize the enemy. So Russia is compelled to keep attacking because Putin, the greatest military genius ever, orders them to retake this. And the Ukrainians have maneuvered, they develop the tactical situations so that the Russians and their North Korean buddies are constrained by terrain. We call this in the SEALs channelizing the enemy. So they have to operate on this narrow front. And anyone who ever saw the movie Thermopylae or Gates of Fire, right? You've got 300 Spartans. It didn't matter that there were a million Persians because the battlefield only accommodated 300 guys. You always want to maneuver your enemy into that. Whatever the enemy has as an advantage, you want to fight in a circumstance where that doesn't matter. But the other thing that the Ukrainians take advantage of and do so masterfully is the idiotic, inept, utterly stupid and wasteful tactics of the Russians, right? The Russians have almost lost 10,000 tanks.
Yeah.
They've almost lost 20,000 armored personnel. They've lost more, just the way it is now, than any European army in NATO has. They, they've lost more, and they don't care. And they should.
Well, they should really care because they can't replace these losses at a fast enough speed to even keep eventually the minimum number of vehicles you're going to need on the battlefield. They can't produce enough tanks to catch up to the losses.
Well, here's, we talk a lot about the hollowing out of the Russian army. Look, they are putting themselves in a generational hole, right? They're running out of T-72s. They don't even send the T-90s in anymore because they desperately want to sell them to people. And people just see them, the turrets going into orbit, and they say, maybe we don't want a space program. We just really wanted a tank.
Right.
So they're not going to be able to get out of this. They're just not. So this war is going to end eventually, whether it's a territorial settlement, whatever it is. But the Russian army is down to coffee grounds and cigarette butts, right? And the Ukrainian armed forces are going to be resupplied. Ukraine is going to be in NATO. Again, I love reminding people how dead effing wrong I was about Putin. I thought he was too smart to do what he's doing here, but I didn't factor in the cray-cray. I just, I just didn't.
And it's difficult to factor it in today. I mean, he gave, and we're going to move to the map in Chasiv Yar. He's already given his Russian commanders and troops assaulting Chasiv Yar a deadline to take that city by. It was months ago. That deadline came and went. And now I see Ukraine having success driving Russian troops out of the lodgment they had successfully taken in some of the eastern neighborhoods of Chasiv Yar. Chasiv Yar is on a high escarpment. So these are neighborhoods at the bottom of the hill, basically.
Yeah, I've got that. But once I finally do have the right map up, there has been fighting in northeast Chasiv Yar. There is a place called the aggregate plant. It is an industrial facility there, just where the top battle icon is. Here's one of the things that is already happening. You know, Putin and the Kremlin and Gerasimov or whoever the meat puppet du jour up there is, take back Chasiv Yar. They can't do it. Okay. And a little tenuous saying that they've got the equipment, right? They've got enough people. They've got the gasoline. They've got the artillery. They've got everything. They don't have the leadership, and the children, the convicts, the old men that they are putting into these battle problems. Look, it matters. Morale matters. It just doesn't matter if you've got the King Tiger tank or whatever, latest Abrams, the best fighter plane. If you don't have people who want to fight, or even if you don't want to fight, you don't know how to fight, you can't win. It doesn't happen, right? It just doesn't happen. It doesn't matter if you have swords made of iron and you're fighting enemies with sword made of bronze. It doesn't matter if you can't fight, if you're unwilling. And why would these guys be willing, Alan?
I can't.
They've lost.
They're far from home. They're being killed. Their buddies are being killed and wounded right around them. And eventually they won't be paid. By the way, because Russia won't have the money to do
it. Well, they just, and they're shooting themselves in the foot at home. So if you're a Wagner guy and you lost both legs in Ukraine, you're not getting any veteran benefits. Eventually the outrage will start. But before the outrage comes the slowdown, comes the frank discussions around the dinner table saying, no, son, don't do it. Dad'll get whatever, $20,000 a year. You're not going to make it a year.
Yeah.
You're not going to make it 2 weeks.
Or in many cases in Russia, it's the son telling the father not to sign that contract and take the $30,000 bonus, because it's the father who has worked his entire life, possibly fallen into debt, or possibly pursued some petty crimes of one kind or another. And that $30,000 bonus represents to him, he might be 50 years old, the only opportunity he has to balance the books and maybe have something left for his family. That's a terrible, terrible position to be in, but that is the position thousands and thousands of Russian men in their 50s are in today.
And this war is almost unique, maybe throughout recent history, and I mean a couple hundred years ago, that you've got the average age of combatants in certain areas that 42-year-old men.
Yeah.
And this is to put not a sort of cartoonish point on it. You can get an 18-year-old to charge a machine gun nest, but you can't get a 40-year-old guy to do it, right? You can't. That's why traditionally you don't recruit 40-year-old guys. But that point is moot because the Russians aren't training anybody. And I'm not talking about training them to be naval special warfare operators. I mean, just training them to be soldiers, right? Even how to march, even to be able to look up at the sky and know north, south, east, and west, right? You and I can do that, but you have to learn, right? Somebody's got to tell you, look, there's Orion, there's Polaris, there's right?
Yeah.
They don't know anything, let alone using a lensatic compass and a topographical map under pressure at night in split-second decisions where life and death is absolutely dependent on your land navigation.
Yeah. You don't want to rely on me in that situation, but I would rely on.
No, your land navigation's pretty good.
Not bad. Yeah.
It's not bad.
Also in Chazivyar, and by the way, the Ukrainians are not driving the Russians back to Bakhmut. What they are doing in Chazivyar is taking a lot of Russian casualties as Russia tries to decide how to attack Chazivyar, which is a problem they haven't solved yet.
No, and so trying to conservatively estimate the casualties in the Bakhmut area. Wow. But the last time you and I spoke to uh, John about this, and that was what, 2 years ago.
Yeah.
It was 45 to 50,000 conservatively. That was 2 years ago. Conservatively, I think we are really, and you follow this as closely as I do. I think we're looking at what, 200,000 just in this area. And as we've always said, you know, Bakhmut, the gateway to Chasiv Yar.
Yeah.
And we said 2 years ago, it's never going to fall. And we're not wrong yet.
Right. It was last April that Chasiv Yar was coming under increasing Russian pressure. A lot of people actually predicted last April that Chasiv Yar would quickly fall, and Chuck was the one who said that's not a possibility. Now Chasiv Yar has been reduced to rubble, but Chasiv Yar does remain a pretty important defensive pin for Ukraine in this area, and they are making the Russians continue to pay. The other interesting thing about Chasiv Yar, Chuck, is that the number of daily engagements around Chasiv Yar have been declining.
Yep. And this, I got up this morning to put this one up. One of the reasons I did was there was so few points of contact on this map. And a lot of times, I will even double up some of the battle icons to let people see the map more clearly. But you can see that there were limited numbers of contact here, and the Russians kind of go in waves. And we've talked about the gains that Russia has made, but every time there's a battle icon on this map, we're basically dealing with a point of contact that is somewhere between 30 to 900 Russians, with the median being somewhere around 40 or 50, 60, even 100. 80% of those guys are killed in every point of contact. They lose somewhere between 20 and 80%. What has been interesting to me is I've watched the initial casualties go down recently. And that doesn't mean the Russians are fighting better or smarter or achieving more. It's when the Russians receive about 20% casualties, they start to run, right? They bug out. That's one of these tattletales I look at. That is telling me a lot about their morale. It's telling me a lot about the chain of command. It's telling me a lot about the efficacy of the chain of command. These guys are getting in here and saying, this has gone sideways and I'm out of here. And, I encourage everyone, look, watch the battle footage. Ukraine is really good at putting together these 10-minute videos of what happened in today's assaults around Bakhmut. Watch that. And rippling effects like the major defeat up in Kupiansk about it was 6 weeks ago now. Larger than normal attack, about 1,000 Russians. The force was split up before contact. Every stupid thing you could do, they did. They split the force. They put a swamp between the two of them. They couldn't operate in support. And in 20 minutes, the Ukrainians killed about 900 Russians. Nobody forgets about that when you're a Russian. They don't. And what's amazing to me is the Ukrainians could smoke that operation prevent people from running away. They died in place. But now I see contacts. Look, you can expect to take 10 or 20% casualties on initial contact, right? That's something that the 82nd Airborne would shrug off and keep going, right? You assault into the contact. It's a telltale, Alan, that the Russians aren't smoking that stuff anymore, man.
Mm.
They they are they are not falling for it, and they're pulling back.
Well, just 60 kilometers as the crow flies to Pokrovsk from Chasiv Yar. And this is really where the center of engagements are occurring now. This is the hotspot, one of the two hotspots on the 01. About a quarter of daily engagements reported by the general staff of the Ukrainian army are occurring around Pokrovsk right now. And roughly 50% of daily Russian casualties are being counted down here in Pokrovsk. It's
Yeah,
a pretty serious situation for Ukraine, but it's hard to say what Ukraine is going to make of it.
well, I can say this. It took the Russians 12 years to take Avdiivka, and now it's taken them about what 6 months to get to the gates of Pokrovsk, but they haven't entered it yet, right? They haven't gotten there yet. And we talk about this a lot. Look at the Russians. Circumstances have made Ukraine fight basically on the defensive, and that's Mike Johnson, right? That's the reason that Ukraine is fighting on the defensive. When you've got that epic military genius, Vladimir Putin, and he simply says attack, 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 attack. Ukraine has been masterful at doing this. There is losing terrain on the battlefield, and then there is losing important terrain on the battlefield. And Ukraine has been willing to fight and a defensive, slowly retiring fight here, attriting the Russians as they come, but then also burdening them with this kind of useless territory. And when we're going to look here in just a minute at the southern portion of this battle space, which is around Kurakove, where the Russians have made some advances, but we're going to look at just what exactly all that blood and treasure and blown up equipment, what have they gotten from it? And it isn't that much.
No.
So, and I would just sum this up, just on the Pokrovsk axis, just from Avdiivka to where they are right now, I am estimating that over the last 6 months, they have probably lost 70,000 people just to get to here. Okay, that's more than 10 years of the Vietnam War. I mean, these casualty numbers are you can't wrap your brain around them.
No. And that's to advance, what, 20 odd miles?
Yeah, 20 miles. So there's the other thing about this, right? They've advanced 20 miles, but they've got to, they have got to keep the offensive going. So we used this example before we came on. They got to deliver a dozen eggs to the front line over 20 miles. 12 eggs don't get there. 2 get there. And the Ukrainians are really good about smashing Russian logistics. We see that going on constantly. So all that effort, and they haven't gotten the nugget they needed, was Pokrovsk. And I get tired of some of the military experts. Well, if Pokrovsk falls, no. It is a transportation nexus, but it is almost completely destroyed. And if the Russians take it, the Russians are incapable of making use of any highway they seize. They can't do it. They grabbed Bakhmut. what did it get them? Nothing. They're
Yeah.
still not at Chasiv Yar. And we, you and I and John and everyone else said 2 years ago, this battle is for Chasiv Yar.
Yeah.
Bakhmut means nothing.
Yeah.
And it still means nothing.
So there are about 11,000 civilians still living in Pokrovsk somehow. Honestly, I don't know how, but the Ukrainians are evacuating civilians. And, often a sign that Ukraine is going to drop back. But I actually, as I look at the map from 17 December, 18 December here in Pokrovsk, I'm not sure Ukraine is looking for a defensive line to fall back to. Rather, it really appears that they are inflicting as many Russian casualties and equipment losses as possible and doing it pretty successfully.
Yeah, so we've definitely got an attritional battle. And, you and I have been doing this a long time. If you know what the enemy is going to do, it's on you to punish them for it. And the way the Russians are fighting, Ukraine knows what they're going to do every morning. Every one of these battle icons with the little red arrow, these are places the Russians continuously attack. And you said this a million times. You don't have any chance of succeeding in an attack when you attack at the same place, using the same approach vectors, at the same time of day, 5 days a week. That's never going to work. It isn't going to work. And the fact that Russian officers still order it, it's insanity.
That is a story your maps tell every single day, Chuck. Some of your maps could, if you put them on plastic or sheer paper and laid them over one another, you would see these Russian attacks coming along the same route every single day.
Well, there are places like Kremenna where I went back to a map 3 years ago and I was looking at the same map. And Kremenna is another one of those places. The Russians had 5, 6, 7, 10-1 superiority at the point of attack. They finally got to the Oskil Reservoir, but they still haven't taken the whole thing. It boggles the mind. Only in the Russian army could you get away with being that poor of a commander, that inept of a battle manager, that inept of a manager of the nation's resources. Only in the Russian army could this happen.
Well, I believe the Ukrainian commander in Pokrovsk was relieved just a few days ago. And of course, in the middle of such an intense battle as is happening around Pokrovsk, you really don't want to be replacing your commanding officer, but sometimes you need to.
Yeah, absolutely. That happens. The real fault was the commander over the last 24 months ago. That commander did not prepare positions in the eventuality that the Russians were going to take Avdiivka. We've talked about that. There was no defense in depth. So all of that terrain, almost 20 miles in some places was turned over to the Russians, but not turned over. They had to pay for every meter of it. And when we're talking about numbers approaching 100,000 casualties, yeah. You can divide 100,000 casualties by the kilometers gained, and you can see just how abysmal that is. I mean, most wars don't have 100,000 casualties, let alone a battle over 2 cities.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You look at Pokrovsk, Kurakova, and Velika Novosilka. These 3 battle areas are relatively tied together, especially Pokrovsk and Kurakova. how the Ukrainians have continued to defend in Kurakova is beyond me. I mean, it is a it's a trap waiting to close on the Ukrainians in this salient.
Yeah, there's if you are looking at that map, uh, there is a water course south of Kharkov, and there are little towns there, uh, Antonivka, Ilyinka, Roman towns along that water course. It was amazing to me just how long the Ukrainians were able to fight that, appendix that was sticking down there, that salient. They were literally getting shot at by both sides. Rifle ranges overlapped to the north and the south. But, you talk about a stubborn sort of retreat. You and I talked about this developing situation 4 weeks ago. And I said, look, I'd cut and run. I mean, forget it. It amounts to nothing. But the Ukrainians made the Russians pay. They made them pay for it.
In Kurakova, I'm going to say this with 50% confidence, Chuck. I believe it was the thermal power plant in Kurakova that the Ukrainians fully dismantled and moved in order to reassemble it and then resume generating power with it somewhere else in the country. And it's important to think about that because this shows just how resilient the Ukrainians are. If they have something of tremendous value, and power generators are of tremendous value in Ukraine today, the Ukrainians are going to find a way to preserve it, save it, reuse it, or repurpose it. And this is I think that story of disassembling the needed parts of that thermal power plant, which I believe was in Kurakova, and reassembling it elsewhere. That is going to be a great story about how Ukraine survived this war.
Yeah, I mean, I take absolutely nothing away from the combat engineers and the troops who pulled off that incomprehensible feat, right? Disassembling a power plant and moving it out of harm's way. But I'd also say this, it shows me the ineptitude and the ineffectiveness of the Russian troops. There is no freaking way that should have happened, right? There is no reason why the Russians didn't obliterate that place with artillery, kill everyone who was trying to do it. There's just, it shouldn't have happened, right? No mercy on the part of the Russians. Look, I'll say this: they suck. They suck, right?
They do in any number of ways.
None of the good ways.
Yeah, none of the good ways. But how they fight and why they're fighting. Yeah, you can easily criticize this Russian force. I still to this day, Chuck. I know it's not happened for the first time in this war. It's happened in other wars through the ages. But how a soldier can, in cold blood, murder another soldier, disarmed, taken captive. This has taken place over 120 times, documented now. Russian soldiers killing Ukrainian POWs, including 16 Ukrainian POWs in Pokrovsk.
Yeah, and besides being murder, besides being a war crime, besides not being justifiable under any military exigency or circumstance, you crystallize the will and fighting desire of your opponent, right? You you have demonstrated to every Ukrainian soldier that if you surrender, you're going to be murdered. So they'll fight to the death. Uh, these cases are all being investigated. If there is a ray of sunshine here, it's that the people who perpetrated these murders aren't likely to survive the war, right? It's going to be hard to prosecute some of these guys because, frankly, they're being killed at an astounding rate. There isn't a single Russian unit in Ukraine now that is at anywhere near its battlefield strength, its book strength. Uh, Russian casualty numbers, they're unknowable at this point because the Russians don't report real numbers up the chain of command. The cutest thing you can say about it is that in some cases, Russian units will carry soldiers on their book who they know are dead. And they will do that so that the families at home keep getting paid. Now, as noble as that sounds, uh, you're on the hook for a battalion, right? And it turns out you've got half of a company. This is one of the problems that Russia has already faced. You can't untangle this ball of yarn. Putin doesn't know what he's commanding. He doesn't know what the real numbers are. No one tells him the truth. And there is going to come a time where these overstressed units, look, we've said this a million times, the easiest thing to do on a battlefield is attack. That's it. Nothing gets simpler than that. But when the Ukrainians start pressing back, and these units are going to have to do some real soldiering, right? They're going to have to fight Battle of the Bulge kind of style, small units, pull them together. Look, that's heroism. That's what you pay soldiers for. There isn't a unit in Ukraine that can do that anymore. I'm on the hook for that. I'll stand by it. They can't do it. So we need to give Ukraine the ability to throw those punches.
Exactly. And by the way, Ukraine uh, is taking care of the manpower problem that they've had on the zero line. That an additional 50,000 Ukrainian troops have been trained in Operation Interflex. That's a group of European nations training Ukrainian troops, and 50,000 troops have completed their training. Not saying they're going to be on the zero line before Christmas, but they will be on the zero line relatively quickly. And probably one place where they may see action is in Velika Novosilka. This is a great map that Chuck published on 17 December because you can see how Kurakova and Velika Novosilka are related on this battle map. There is a pretty worrisome Russian salient that's driving up to the H-15 highway to the northeast of Velika Novosilka. So a lot of red territory on this map, Chuck.
Yeah. So people looking at this, you can see the Ukrainian held salient that sort of droop in the line just to the west of Kurakove. That's going to be terrain that is Ukraine will fight an attritional battle there, but they're going to eventually have to withdraw from that. Uh, Everything to the east of Velika Novosilka has been taken within the last 18 months. Uh, Down where the text block is, it's Vuhledar down there. So we can see that, the Russians have taken terrain, but you could look at that terrain and look at the roads. And the roads are not going the right way to supply your Russian forces, especially if you are trying to go west. You can see it's the O series highway, the 0510 there, which comes out of Kurakove and heads towards Velika Novosilka. That is an obvious and easily hittable ground line of communication and supply. Looking at this map, and if things continue to go as they probably will go, you can see the Mokryali River there, going from the north to the south. That is probably where the line is going to wind up eventually. But the Ukrainians are not going to just cut and run. They are going to make the Russians pay for every inch of that. And folks, if you want to know how the war is going, zoom your map up to as high as it'll go and look at those little green lines. That's where everything moves, and those are the fighting positions, right? So those are the tree breaks that surround this ancient agricultural land. These don't offer much cover, but they offer concealment. And that's where the war is really fought. So you look at those green lines, think of that, but then I want you to look at all the open space, and that's death. If you are standing there between those two tree lines, you're dead. You're going to eat a drone.
Especially in the winter. Not because it's cold, not because it's snowy, but because you just show up so much more clearly on a snow-covered field.
Exactly. You switch your drone to white hot, and bang, there you are. Or black hot works good in the winter time too. Yeah. So you're a little black dot. But again, so Ukraine has slowly withdrawn from all the territory, so directly south of Kharkov, down there, around there in that text block is where Vuhledar is. And remember what it took for the Russians to take that. We had the Battle of Vuhledar 1 and the Battle of Vuhledar 2, where they lost 40 tanks in 2 days of fighting that they fought about 4 hours a day. And they lost 120 armored personnel carriers. The Battle of Vuhledar 2 was about the same, fought by the same units, the 115th Brigade of Russian Naval Infantry, who got not decimated, annihilated, right? Utterly destroyed root and branch. The only thing they didn't lose was the guidon, so they could remember what unit they were in. So again, the ineptitude, the wastefulness, it's if you want to know how bad the Russian army is, they started this as a superpower. They're fighting a smaller nation that is undersupplied, badly equipped, and betrayed by its allies, and the Russians still can't do anything.
Yeah. And the Russians get all the supplies they need simply by snapping their fingers from Iran, drones and ballistic missiles from North Korea, artillery shells, artillery pieces, soldiers, and ballistic missiles from China, high-tech replacement parts, and motors for drones, and that a number of other things that people aren't so clear about. But China is definitely supplying Russia with some of the resources it needs to keep fighting this war. I think it's these maps, Chuck, that you've drawn up of Velika Novosilka, Kurakova, Pokrovsk especially. These are the maps that really depict the hardship on the zero line that Ukraine is going through right now. But there, I think, will be some hopeful signs coming up as we come to Christmas and enter the dead of winter. And one of those hopeful signs is that as one of Joe Biden's last acts as president, he has tried to provide everything to Ukraine that he possibly can. It is a race against the clock at this point for Joe Biden to keep his promises all that equipment has got to be underway. All those supplies have got to be underway before January 20th.
Yeah. And again, this is stuff they needed 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. And as I pointed out, there isn't anyone in the Pentagon that doesn't understand completely what it's going to take to fight and win this war. They get it. And the corollary to that is every military officer and senior non-commissioned officer in the Pentagon knows that Ukraine is not getting anywhere near the equipment, the materiel, the training, the weapons it needs to win this war. Everybody knows it. Okay, but again, it's not, military officers don't make policy, right? They execute policy. So this is all in the hands of the commander-in-chief. However, I do hold this out, and I recommend it to everybody. When Putin betrays, double crosses, screws over, fails to deliver on whatever bargains he's made with the incoming commander-in-chief, I promise you the incoming commander-in-chief is going to take it badly, right? He is a vindictive person who doesn't want to have anyone make him look like a monkey. And remember, there's only one leverage he has on Putin, and that is, I'm going to give your enemy everything they need to kick your ass all the way back to Vladivostok. So,
which would be great to see. I hope that Trump does get that message. And we don't know, honestly. We won't know until sometime after January 20th. Perhaps Trump kind of jawbones the enemy at this point. Half the time he says things that the enemy wants to hear, in this case Putin. Half the time he says things that Putin never wants to hear from an American president, much less Donald Trump. So we'll have to wait and see. And I hate saying that. I can be impatient, but there is no choice in the matter. You simply have to wait and see. My hope is that Ukrainian defensive lines hold, and that there are several points on the zero line, like in Chasiv Yar, and like up around Kharkiv and Vovchansk, where the Ukrainians can succeed in pushing the Russians back. I think that would be a great end of year story. Not that December 31st is any kind of demarcation in a war. It's not. Every day is the same as the day before.
Right. We're coming into the solstice now. Winters are tough in Ukraine. They are in a war where there is some sort of stasis, or you've got one side you can point to being largely on the defensive, the other side being largely on the offensive. It is harder for the troops who are trying to conduct offensive operations, right? Even just think of it this way. The troops on the offensive, they got to walk to work every morning, right? And the people on the defensive, they don't. They just look over their front sight every morning and there's a Russian. One little tug. That's all. One little tug.
Well, that is going to conclude indications and warnings here on day 1029 of Russia's full-scale genocidal invasion of Ukraine. I think Chuck and I will be back just before Christmas, at least one more time.
Oh, absolutely.
And
at least one more time.
Yeah, and then back sometime between Christmas and New Year's Eve. Again, focusing on maps, depending, of course, on anything else that's in the news. But the maps are the key to understanding what's happening in Ukraine right now. So in this time of hardship and hope, it rings even more true to say Slava Ukraini.
Heroem Slava. And everybody, we're here to help you dominate your own information warfare microcosm. We're giving it to you, the good, the bad, the ugly, but we want to make sure you know what's going on in Ukraine. That's what we're here for.
Real information in real time. Thanks, Chuck, and I'll see you again soon.